So hi, Dr. Ritamarie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, hi, I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about with your listeners.
I know as the expert on blood sugar and insulin resistance, I had to have you on. And I've been following your work personally for a number of years now, and listening to the podcast episodes you have, and you've been on a lot of different summits, and there's YouTube videos, so many resources for people to look into. But I had to have you on the Hormones in Harmony podcast. So yeah, thank you, and I'm excited to chat with you today. So to start off, could you tell us a bit more about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm in functional medicine and nutrition, big pieces of what I do. And I got into this from my own health challenges ages and ages and ages ago, like 35 years ago. So I've been actually in practice for officially almost 30 years now. And what I do is I help people to use choices that they make every day, choices in diet, choices in lifestyle, choices in thought processes, how they breathe, how they move, to actually impact health and actually access the inner wisdom of the body, because the body wants to be in balance. It's just our lifestyles, our choices, the environment, the toxins, etc., the food choices, all put us out of balance. So one of my specialties is insulin resistance and blood sugar balance, because I feel like it's one of the core things that affects everything else. So a lot of folks jump in and want to, balance hormones. Let's get some estrogen on board. How do we get more progesterone? When in reality, we really need to look deeper into what are the other imbalances that lead. And with insulin, and we're going to talk a little bit about insulin resistance today, insulin resistance actually contributes to hormone imbalance and resistance of all the other hormones. And we'll talk about what hormone resistance is as well to make sure everybody's real clear.
Definitely. I think people, and even on this podcast, I have guests on, they talk about seed cycling and herbs and all of these fancy things, when the foundation's often being overlooked, and people are eating healthier foods. They're trying to make upgrades, but they're going for the granola and the yogurts, and they're all still full of sugar, and fruit smoothies. They're trying to do a good thing, but they're actually not helping the situation. They could actually be making things worse.
And so, actually, I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of times they're making things worse. Yes.
And to start off with, and I mentioned before we hit record that I speak about blood sugar balance all the time, but I haven't actually gone into much detail on what exactly blood sugar is, what it means, and what is insulin. So can we start there by giving us a bit of a overview as to what these things are and these terms, because we're probably going to be using them throughout this whole podcast.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So when we eat food, regardless of what we eat, the body breaks it down in the digestive tract into its components, and one of the components of that, the fuel from that, is glucose. So glucose has to transport from the intestinal tract into the bloodstream, where it floats around, but it doesn't do us any good when it's in the bloodstream. What has to happen is it needs to get into the cells. It needs to get into the brain cells, the muscle cells, the liver cells, the heart cells, all the cells in the body. And so the transport vehicle for that to get into the cells is insulin. And insulin is a hormone that gets secreted by the pancreas, and it actually latches on to the glucose and helps it get into the cells. Once it's in the cells, then what happens is we have these things in the cells called mitochondria. And that actually takes that glucose and converts it into usable energy that the body can use. So there's a lot that goes into the mechanism of getting the glucose into the cells with the insulin. There's certain nutrients that are required to be there to help make that export happen. And the cells have to be kind of intact and healthy cells. And when the cells get damaged by bad fats in the diet, by toxins, by things that get into the bloodstream from the intestinal tract that shouldn't, from leaky gut. All of these things contribute to these toxins and lack of nutrients floating around in the bloodstream that prevents that. So when we get into a mode of eating kind of the standard American diet, which I think most of us grew up on, or the modified American diet, which is the quote-unquote healthier version of the American diet, we end up with a lot of sugar. And we end up with a lot of starch that comes in. Flour products, or most people are eating 75% of their food as some sort of flour, whether it's pasta or bread or muffins or cakes or granola. they're all getting those things. And that puts a tax on the pancreas, first of all, for having to produce lots of insulin. So the insulin gets produced, and the more sugar that's eaten, the more starch that's eaten, the more over time insulin gets produced, and the cells can get damaged by insulin. What people don't realize, a lot of the problems that diabetics get in that are type 1s and they're taking insulin are actually caused by the insulin, the later in life stuff. So there's damage. There's like a price to pay for insulin. Perfect amount, yes, great, that's perfect. But when we have too much, then it can start to cause damage to those cells. So the combination of all of that, the pancreas gets kind of stressed out and can't produce enough, or it's producing too much, which is causing damage, causes those cells to become resistant. It's like, stop, don't produce anymore. I got enough. I don't want any more. And we develop a condition called insulin resistance. In younger people, in younger ages, and some people can look back and see, oh, I was like that when I was a kid. The overproduction of that insulin before the resistance develops actually causes people to have these high levels of insulin, and the blood sugar drops dramatically. And these people are like, I need to eat because my blood sugar is low. And as it develops, we develop the resistance, and then we may still get those same symptoms of feeling like the blood sugar is low, but the blood sugar isn't low anymore. It's actually the amount of sugar that gets into the cells that goes wrong. You can have a 200 blood sugar, which is very high, and feel like you have low blood sugar symptoms like dizziness and lightheadedness and inability to focus, because the sugar's in the wrong place. It's in the blood, not in the cells.
Absolutely. I've seen that so many times. And with myself personally, I have done like the finger prick glucometers and like the continuous, the ones that you can put in your arms. And I have PCOS as well. And my blood sugar is much better controlled now. But in the past, I would think, oh, I need to eat every 2 hours. I just can't fast. I would get hangry. I would get shaky and irritable. I would need food immediately. And I would check my blood sugar and it would be sky high. And I thought I was going into like hypoglycemia. And I've had clients do the same. They track it and it's crazy. Yeah.
Yep. I've had that because I have everybody, check their glucose either with the finger prick or continuous. So
yeah.
I think that in the future, every household is going to have a glucometer.
That would be amazing. That would save a lot of medical bills and pharmaceutical drugs being needed with just such a simple shift. I know it's a bit of effort to get used to these, and we'll talk about how you test optimal levels and all of that as we go on. But apart from the long-term complications of diabetes that we hear about, what are some of the short-term or like beginning symptoms of insulin resistance? So some signs of your blood sugar being off, maybe typical ones that people may know about, and maybe some unconventional ones that people may have no idea are related to blood sugar and insulin.
Exactly. So the ones that you just mentioned, that feeling hangry and irritable and cranky and lightheaded in between meals can actually be a sign of high levels of blood sugar and insulin resistance. But what people don't realize is when the fat accumulates around the waist. I see a lot of folks who have great legs and great arms, and there's big belly, almost looks pregnant belly or hanging over the pants. And that can be a sign because the fat accumulation around the waist is related to insulin resistance. Fatigue, just in general, not like the in-between meal type fatigue, but hard to get up in the morning, hard to get going in the late afternoon, the drop of energy in the late afternoon, that can be related to insulin resistance. Brain fog, we hear this a lot. When I first started talking brain fog was when I experienced it myself when I was in my 20s. Nobody talked brain fog. What is that? I said that to somebody. I said, I feel like I have brain fog. Like, what is that? And the doctor's like, brain fog, what is that? But it's really that feeling of like you can't focus. You can't, like you're talking to somebody and it's like every bit of effort to even get the words that they're saying to penetrate into your consciousness. And we hear that all the time. Brain fog is a common expression now. And that can be related to insulin resistance as well. So there's a lot of that. And the feeling of being hungry right after you eat, or that feeling of needing something sweet right after a meal. It's like, well, I feel pretty full, but I sure would like a little bit of chocolate right now, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Really all our early signs. And later signs that are dangerous High blood pressure can be related to insulin resistance because of the way that the insulin affects the endothelial linings in the blood vessels. It causes them to stiffen and not be able to, be elastic enough to allow the blood flow, and then the pressure builds up, and a lot of cardiac things, and memory problems, memory loss.
Yeah, so like pretty much any symptom that you can think of may in some way be related to insulin. We can probably be safe to say that. Yeah. And I think people experience that quite frequently. Like, I think most people have had the experience where they go to a restaurant and have the bread basket, they have the big bowl of pasta, and then they're stuffed, they're really full, they can't have any more food, and then the waiter comes and asks if they want a dessert. And they're like, oh yeah, I can fit that in my stomach, and they can just eat that. They're craving the sugar, and then they go home, they're a little bit tired, and then they're hungry a couple of hours later. And that is the insulin that's playing a role in that as well. And how is insulin and blood sugar related to hormones? So this being the Hormones in Harmony podcast, I have a lot of women who have thyroid issues, and also PCOS is a big one. How is that involved?
Well, there's a lot of ways that it's involved. So let's start with insulin being high, because that's typically happening in an insulin resistant situation. So the insulin is high. It affects thyroid hormones. It affects the secretion of TSH. It affects the receptors. So we talk about insulin resistance, and that's common. More and more people are talking like leptin is another hormone. We talk leptin resistance, but in reality, you can have resistance to just about every other hormone. And thyroid resistance is a commonly overlooked situation in people with thyroid symptoms. There's so many people, I'm sure you see it, where they go to the doctor and the doctor says, they say, I think I have a thyroid problem because I have all these citrus, and they test their TSH and they say, your TSH is fine, you don't have a thyroid problem. Or they, even if they're well educated, and they go further and they test their free T3 and free T4, and they test their antibodies, which would be a more thorough, and they say, no, you're fine. It could be a situation of thyroid resistance, thyroid receptor resistance. And there's quite a number of things that can affect that. And one of those is insulin. The high levels of insulin can actually damage the receptors for thyroid as well as for insulin. So that's how the thyroid is related. I would say for sex hormones, there's a huge interaction. So if someone is on birth control pills and they have high levels of estrogen, that's going to affect their thyroid. It's going to affect the thyroid binding globulin. When the thyroid levels are not optimal, it affects the secretion in the pancreas of insulin. So if the thyroid levels are not optimal, the insulin levels can't be. And there's a lot of studies that link those two. If you don't get your thyroid under control, then you can't get your insulin levels under control. Well, there's another layer to that, right? You've got these sex hormones, and so many people are on either hormone replacement without properly assessing it, or they're on birth control pills, or they're eating from plastic containers and they're getting all these xenoestrogens, and that's affecting the thyroid, which then affects the insulin. The adrenals, right? The adrenal glands were made to keep us safe from tigers. And we don't have a lot of real tigers running around, but we have a lot of virtual tigers right now. Most people that you talk to are stressed out all the time. They're stressed out because they listen to the news and there's all the gloom and doom. They're stressed out because their jobs are requiring a lot more attention and they're not getting enough time with their family. They're stressed out because they have kids or elderly parents that need care. People are stressed out all the time, and now high levels of cortisol affect insulin dramatically. So they affect it indirectly by affecting the thyroid, because it creates a thyroid resistance, and it affects the conversion of thyroids from T4 to T3. But the way it affects insulin is that high level of cortisol, like body's getting ready to run from a tiger. So what does the body do? Mobilize stored sugar. How does it do that? Well, it usually looks for protein, because that's just, biochemically, that's the mechanism. So it can be breaking down muscle tissue, but it can also go for fat. The breaking down of muscle tissue, I always tell people, when you're stressed out, your body is literally converting your muscles in your thighs into belly fat. Because what happens is we mobilize the stored sugars that are stored in protein, that are stored in the liver as glycogen, and we have an elevation in the blood sugar. You didn't eat the candy bar, but getting stressed out makes your blood sugar raise as if you just ate a candy bar. And now we have that whole cascade we talked about earlier. So there's a lot of interactions.
Yeah, so many different pathways. And I think, again, people may notice as well that on this low carb diet, they're, quote, doing all the right things. But if they're stressed out their mind, they're not sleeping, then they're going to be insulin resistant and still gaining weight regardless. And with the adrenals, I think it works the opposite way as well. Having the high blood sugar and high insulin is stressful. So everything's there's no like isolation of body systems like most conventional doctors believe.
Exactly.
People like you and me understand, and the listeners understand, that everything's very intimately connected. And many of the listeners as well, and me in the past, have struggled with skin issues, whether that's acne, rashes, premature aging. Could you talk a bit about how high blood sugar can affect our skin?
Yeah, so first of all, the elevation, like when we're requiring a lot of insulin and the pancreas is producing a lot of insulin because to handle the sugar. First of all, the sugars themselves, right? The high sugar diet, the high starch diet, that affects the skin. That affects the nutrients that are available that are used up when we're having to digest all that sugar and use all that insulin. Those nutrients are also important for skin. Zinc is a super important one for skin health. B vitamins are super important. Our fat soluble vitamins, all of these things are affected. But also those high levels of sugar that contribute to that insulin resistance also contributed to gut dysbiosis. And we have such an interaction between the gut and insulin. There's insulin-like peptides that get produced. There's all sorts of things that get produced. There's like 28 hormones in the gut that get produced to digest a meal. And some of those are directly related to the insulin requirements. So when we're eating a diet that's not balanced, when we're eating a diet that's too high in sugars, when we're not getting good organisms coming in through our foods, through fermented foods, probiotic-rich foods, that's affecting the gut, which affects then the whole insulin stuff. And the gut dysbiosis and the problems in the gut also affects the skin, because the skin is a detox organ, right?
Absolutely.
And fatty acids that get out of balance, so important for skin health. Well, DHA is a super important nutrient for helping the insulin get into the cells. And DHA is also important for a lot of other things like brain health, and it's affected, it has an effect on the skin. So
that's important. Yeah, I don't think people are aware that it also takes nutrients to process glucose. So the more sugars and glucose you eat, maybe it's depleting your nutrients a little bit. And with skin issues as well, I know that increased insulin can upregulate sebum production, making skin more oily and prone to breakouts. And then there's the connection with advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, where it kind of, I don't know the whole process, but it kind of affects your skin, and then it can lead to premature aging. So AGE.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And it affects the insulin receptors as well, those glycation end products, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Not cool, but you know what I mean.
No, but
not a good thing.
And
interesting.
There's an effect on testosterone, which we didn't mention earlier, because people with PCOS, right? They have excess levels of testosterone as a result of this whole insulin cascade, and then the skin breaks out because of that excess estrogen. Excess,
absolutely.
Balances between them.
And for you personally, what do you think has a bigger influence on weight? Calories or blood sugar and insulin? So there's one side of the camp where people say it's just calories in versus calories out. They tend to be like personal trainers who just have an overview of nutrition maybe. And then there's the people who's all about hormones. Calories don't matter. As long as you eat healthy, your body will regulate itself. What do you think about that?
I think that there's a balance there, right? So excess calories are going to contribute to weight gain, right? But deficiencies in calories should contribute then to weight loss. But I see people who are on very low calorie diets, but because of the balance of the sugar, starch, and protein on those diets, and also as a result of the timing of when they're eating those calories, makes a huge difference on their blood sugar and ketones. And so I have people measure blood sugar and ketones on a regular basis. And when we can get there's this magical place that happens, that suddenly no difference in calories. And actually, some people are eating more calories than they were, and they start to lose weight. And I've so many people over and over, they've been trying for years and years. And once they get into this, get the blood sugar balance, which naturally balances ketones usually, they have this problem. The weight just starts to fall off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Magically self-regulates when you give the body what it needs. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's crazy.
And in terms of testing, let's start with the conventional testing, maybe what the reference ranges are. Because I know in the UK, when I ask my clients to get their blood sugar checked, they just get fasting glucose and sometimes HbA1c. And I know that that's not enough. So what would you recommend as being like a full comprehensive panel with optimal ranges as well, if possible?
Absolutely. So I don't know the UK ranges. I know that
I'll convert them. So whatever you say, I'll put in the show notes the conversion to UK.
Okay, yeah, because there's charts. You can get them anywhere. So basically, fasting glucose is the typical gold standard. We measure fasting glucose, and as long as it stays in US terms under 100, you're considered perfectly normal. Okay? And if it goes between 100 and 120, 125, depending on the lab, then it's considered pre-insulin, pre-diabetes or insulin resistance. Most people, unfortunately, are told, oh, just go lose weight and you'll be fine. And they're not given specific instructions on how to do that.
Easier said than done.
Yes, yeah, exactly, because it's this imbalance that's causing it. So I feel like as soon as it's over 100, you're already in trouble and you need to be addressing it. But realistically, if we look at studies, the ideal fasting glucose is no more than 85. No more than 85. As soon as it's going up there, you're putting yourself at risk. And there are some studies that show that you have 4 times the risk of heart disease when the blood sugar is over 90 versus under 90. That's huge. But the doctors are saying, oh, 90 to 100, you're good. Yeah, everything's fine. Now, going back to this hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin A1C is an indirect measure of the average glucose over the past 3 months. And what that is actually a measure of is what percentage of your red blood cells are coated in sugar. And there's a normal amount because we have glucose floating around. Ideally, it should be around 5, right? What the labs are saying is 5.6. So magically, you go from being completely healthy to insulin resistant when it goes from 5.6 to 5.7. Okay, let's just say as you're creeping up in that direction, it's a warning sign. So hemoglobin A1C of 5.6 to 5.7 means that your average over the last 3 months is about 119, 17 to 19. That's high. Average is that. Well, while you're sleeping is when, the longest period of time when it's supposed to be in that, like I said, 85 range. And even if you take the numbers from the conventional, like below 100, if it's 119 on average, that's taking into account 8 to 10 hours of it being in that fasting range. It's getting super high at other times in order to have an average of 119. So that's a very unhealthy number. I like to see people between, say, 4.8 to 5.2. I like it really right around that 5 range. And hemoglobin A1C, unfortunately, at least in the States, maybe they're better in the UK, is usually only tested on people who are already diagnosed as diabetic. So it can be an early warning sign. All right. I had a guy who came to see us after he's been, dealing with his health for a while. And he said that he had never done a hemoglobin A1C because no doctors had ever asked him to do it. And his blood glucose was running typically in the 90s. So he heard about this fair where, they're going to health fair where they're going to do these testing and they're going to do A1C. So he said, great, let's do it. And when he got it tested, it was 11.
Whoa. Oh my God. I didn't know it went that high.
Oh yeah, there's diabetes where it goes to 14, 15,
Whoa.
etc. But it was 11 or 10.9 or something like that. And he'd never been told he had a glucose problem. So he was maintaining fasting glucose in the 90s. But during the day, in response to food and stress, he was a very stressed out person, his glucose levels were going through the roof because the average was in the 200, like 250 or something, 240, I think is, I don't remember the exact numbers, but where his laid out was probably around 240. So it means he was having some super high numbers. Now, as soon as your blood sugar goes above 100, there are studies that show that there's damage that happens to the pancreatic cells that produce the insulin, the islet cells in the pancreas. There are studies that show that once the glucose goes above 120, every single time, not just fasting, but when it goes above 120, we're having damage to the peripheral nerves. And we know that one of the long-term side effects of diabetes is peripheral neuropathy. We also noticed that in this range of 120 to 140, lots of studies showing that the retinal changes that happen in diabetics, the retinopathies, are happening in that range. And in fact, a large percentage of people with the retinopathies, their glucose isn't even going above 100. Like, 6 to 13%, I think was the number. But these people didn't even have anything abnormal about their glucose. So, or their fasting glucose. They were getting these peaks that are really dangerous. So A1C is super important and should be tested on people early on. I think, the first time anybody gets their annual physical with blood work, A1C should be included as a screening. And if it's fine, great, test it again in 5 years, right? If it's fine, great, let's just test it again every 5 years, because as soon as they start to dip into an area where that A1C is climbing, it's suggested that they're developing what I call pre-insulin resistance. So medically, they say insulin resistance starts at 100. I call it pre-insulin resistance when it's before that, anywhere from the 85 to 100. But also, even in people with an fasting glucose of 80, if they're getting these high peaks, as demonstrated when you said, you wore the glucose patch, you do the finger prick, there's a problem here. And we want to catch people before they have damage that is going to cause long-term problems. So that's the two. But then there's insulin itself, fasting insulin. Nobody's testing that. Even in diabetics, they're rarely testing it, right? Unless they're like, oh, you've been diabetic a long time. Maybe you're, moved to pancreatic failure. Let's check. But that number can be critical, especially in people who say, oh, I just have these swings and I get woozy and lightheaded if I don't eat. Let's look at what's your insulin level at. And I think fasting insulin is really good. It's missed. Range for fasting insulin, ideally between 2 and 5. The range on the medical testing is up to 12, I think, or 15 or 18. It's a much higher number, and that's a dangerous level. And then the other thing you can do is postprandial insulin, which means like about 45 minutes to an hour after eating, how is the insulin going up? So maybe it's perfectly fine at 5 or 3 fasting, but in response to food, your body's just shooting out a boatload of insulin, too much, right? So those are important things. I don't do that as often as I do the fasting. And if there's problems with the fasting and there's certain criteria, I'll say, okay, let's just do this. Because it requires that they go to the lab, get their insulin tested, fasting, go out in their car, eat a meal, and then go back in the lab 45 minutes later and get it tested. Because insulin, unfortunately, there's no home test for it.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and it needs to be back in the lab immediately, so it really can't be done, sadly. Maybe in the future they'll come out with some amazing technology. That would be really fun.
I'm sure they will. So those are my favorites. And then I like there's another one called fructosinine, which gives us, it's almost like the A1C, but it's a shorter window. It's giving you more of a window of a month. And it's basically looking at, instead of looking at the glucose on the red blood cells, it's looking at on amino acids, right? So it's a little bit shorter window. It's an older test that used to be done, and now it's having a resurgence now as being a practice. Yeah,
I've never heard of that one before. Interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Peptide's another one. Yeah. But that's like more if somebody's been having a problem for a while and they might be having some pancreatic failure as opposed to, the insulin is too high. But that's an important one to know about, because a lot of folks are diagnosed as type 2 diabetics, and they're really not type 2s, they're type 1s with something called latent adult onset diabetes, or latent diabetes, autoimmune diabetes of adulthood. And it's basically an autoimmune process, doesn't come on when they're younger, mimics type 2 for a while, but there's some critical things to know how to look for that as well.
Mm-hmm. And with you recommending testing to your patients or clients, how do you talk me through what they need to do in terms of fasting, how many hours or minutes after eating, how many times a day, just on average?
Yeah, so for the lab testing, it's typically a 12-hour fast, just if you're going into the lab. But in terms of the glucose at home, you want to get more than fasting. So what I typically have people do is get their glucose in the morning when they first wake up, so we know what their overnight is. Get it right before the meal, and then start testing at intervals. Now, initially, I try to get them, if they're willing, to do it every 15 minutes. Because the peak, what we want to catch is the peak. How high does it go? We don't care what it is 2 hours later. Because you can be perfectly normal. You can start out at 85 and end up 2 hours later at 85, which is normal. But you could be going up to 180 in between. How do I know? That's what was happening to me. And I was totally unaware of it. And it's happened to a lot of my clients. So we have them keep testing until they get to the peak and they see it come down again. So usually for the first day or two, I'll have them test very regularly, every 15 minutes. If we start to see a pattern, like, oh, you always peak at 45 minutes. No matter what you eat, you always peak at 45 minutes. Then we don't have to test all. We just want to see what their peak is. So that's basically how I do it. I usually have it extend out though. So to 2 hours is great if it's back to baseline. But if someone has the symptoms, like you were saying earlier, of I'm ravenous, right? I've got to have them go to 3 or 4 hours to see if it goes down below baseline, to see if they are producing excess insulin.
Mm-hmm. So getting more towards reactive hypoglycemic state that a lot of people can. Okay. And am I right that you don't want it to spike above 120, or is that still too high?
I personally don't want it to spike above 110.
Okay.
Because it gives it a little leeway. And I found that as I did research, the healthier populations, they never went above 100. And 110, as I was, working with people over time, when they go on a diet that I map out for them, which is really, nutrient dense and low glycemic and really healthy diet, most of them barely go over 100. So 110 is my magic number. But, I tell them if occasionally it goes between 110 and 120, then, it's not going to hurt you in the long run. But if it's consistently there, if it's consistently above 120, for sure, we have a problem.
Okay.
And we identify the foods that cause it.
I was going to ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there specific foods? Is everyone very different in your client population? Because I know for me personally, something like sweet potatoes really spike my blood sugar really high, whereas buckwheat or oats don't. So even though I'm eating maybe 50 grams of either, the exact amount of carbs, they react very differently in the body. So can you talk a bit about why that may be happening?
Yeah, so everybody's a little bit different, and I don't know if I can actually give as good an explanation of why. So I've had people who say, I can eat this much banana and my sugar spikes to 180. I have somebody else that says, no, I can put 5 bananas in a green smoothie and my sugar doesn't go anywhere, but give me 1 corn chip and it spikes. And it's all different, right? Certain people, buckwheat shoots it up. I've seen that over and over. For me, buckwheat makes my sugar go up. Sweet potatoes, as long as I keep it with a small amount, won't. But if I eat larger amounts, it will. So it's determining. Pineapple for me, unfortunately, it goes way up with pineapple. Now, you can control that with what you're eating with the food, right? So if you're eating just a plate of sweet potatoes, it's probably going to go up much higher than if you're eating the majority, like 80% of your plate is greens and salad and veggies, non-starchy, and you have a little bit of sweet potato, it's probably going to go up a lot less. So I feel like the glycemic index, it's a guideline, but it's not useful as an overall, because it's basically done by averaging thousands, tens of thousands of people, and we're not average. The best analogy to that I've ever heard was, say you've got a group of 7-year-old boys and you want to buy them sneakers. You know that you're going to be donating to them to be on the soccer team and they need these shoes. And we look and we say, well, the average shoe size for a 7-year-old boy is a 5. And you buy 100 pairs of size 5 shoes. How many of those kids are actually going to be able to wear those shoes? Right?
Yeah.
We have this one-size-fits-all concept of glycemic index and all kinds of health-related stuff, and it just doesn't work that way. So I have people map it out, and then we have them go through a process, an insulin reset, so that they basically for 30 straight days, they do not eat anything that ever raised their sugar above the 110. Right? And they keep it there, and then they do some exercise, and they do some meditation, all the other things that affect it. And at the end of the 30 days, then they'll start to introduce some of the foods, the good healthy foods, not the Cheetos and, M&Ms, but the good healthy foods, like for me, pineapple or blueberries or whatever. And we see, can we tolerate it now that we've helped the insulin receptors to heal somewhat? Do we still need to restrict it? Do we need to go longer? And what do we eat it with? So I determined mangoes shot my sugar up to, I think it was like 135 or 150 if I just ate the mango. But if I took, half a mango or a quarter of a mango, and I had it in one bowl, and I had a big salad or a green smoothie on the other side, and I drank all the greens, and then I had mango, my sugar didn't go up, right? So it's learning, retraining the body to how to eat, so that you don't necessarily have to give up your healthy high glycemic foods, or that you learn how to eat them in a way that doesn't raise your sugar.
Definitely. I love the nutritional bio-individuality. And people always send me a message on Instagram, what should I eat? I have insulin resistance. I'm like, I have no idea how many carbs, what types of carbs, because everyone's very different. And I always recommend, like you said, pairing the healthy fats with the protein and the carbohydrates to slow the absorption. But I have heard from a few practitioners saying that pairing carbohydrates with fats actually increases the insulin response. I see you're shaking your head. Okay.
Totally.
You agree?
Yes,
okay.
It does. And it doesn't necessarily raise the glucose. So the studies I've looked at is it raises the insulin, but not necessarily the glucose, so we can't tell. So I just tell people to stay away from carbs with fat, not carbs from a vegetable standpoint. The vegetable carb is mostly fiber, right? But when you're eating fruit and fat, it's probably not a good idea. I'm just going to eat 2 avocados with my mango, and it's not going to raise my sugar. Yeah, but it can be raising your insulin, and it's causing all the problems. So
interesting.
I avoid that as much as possible. I have people avoid that, periodically. Okay, they put blueberries in their chia porridge. Not a big deal, right? But in general, yeah, that's true. But fiber is what really slows it down. And fiber, like your high fiber foods, your romaine lettuce is a high fiber food. Broccoli is a high fiber food. So if you can combine those foods with some of the sweeter things like the fruits, then you can actually do it, and you don't miss out on all the amazing nutrition in your fruit. I don't recommend it for eating, like I said, Cheetos and M&Ms, because there's no nutritional value there, and in fact, there's some negative nutritional value there.
Yeah, and I think this is where people get confused, because you hear don't eat fruit on its own because it'll spike your blood sugar, but then if you pair it with fat, it's going to spike your insulin.
Yeah.
But if you're doing all of the other things, like you said, just having some blueberries with some in a chia seed pudding isn't going to ruin all of your hard work, but just something to be mindful of. Yeah.
But it's mindful. Just definitely be mindful, and pairing it, like I said, with the greens. So when I went to Hawaii a couple of years ago, I was recently there again, but I didn't do much in the way of fruit. But it was it was mango season. And they had all this amazing tropical stuff that I thought was phenomenal. But if I just sat down for breakfast or lunch or whatever and ate that as a meal, my sugar would go through the roof. But I made a 32-ounce green smoothie that had no fruit in it. That was really tasty and savory. And I didn't put the fruit in there because I wanted to eat the fruit. Mm-hmm. So drink some smoothie, eat some fruit, drink some smoothie, eat some fruit. And I figured out how much fruit I could eat with how much smoothie, and I was able to really enjoy my tropical fruit.
And is it right with the timing of when you eat the macronutrients. So say you have a meal with protein, fat and carbs. If you eat the carbohydrates first, is that going to have a more effect on your blood sugar than if you was to eat them last?
More likely to spike
Okay.
it. There's nothing else there to buffer it.
And what about snacking? What's your thoughts on snacking? Because again, we hear people, you have to eat the 5 mini meals a day to support your metabolism, or you have to do the fasting like we did ancestrally, having 2 meals, 3 meals a day and going between meals without food. Where do you stand?
Yes. So eating 5 meals a day is great if you want to gain weight. And I will tell that to folks who are underweight, have super high metabolism, and they're trying to follow this blood sugar plan because they also have these high levels. I'm like, I'm going to tell you a secret, but don't tell anybody else. I want you to eat every 3 hours. Don't wait the 6 hours between meals because your body burns it so quickly that you need more food. But if you're not trying to gain weight, or you're not an athlete, that's out there and burning up so many calories, it's not a good thing to do because realistically, insulin is a fat storage hormone. And if you eat constantly throughout the day, you're constantly having elevated levels of insulin. And you're going to store the fat that way. So we need gaps, we need fasting. When we do windows of 4 to 6 hours, we start to get elevations in our growth hormone levels. Growth hormone does the opposite of insulin. And in fact, growth hormone and insulin don't coexist very well. So if the insulin level comes up, growth hormone goes down. And growth hormone is super important for putting on lean, doing maintenance and restoration and healing of tissue, and also burning fat. And so when you go out and do heavy duty exercise or burst training, 30 seconds of all out, your growth hormone levels go way up for about an hour and a half. But if you right after that go ahead and, drink a smoothie with fruit in it, or, eat some fruit, or do the drinks like the Gatorade type of thing, you've thwarted that growth hormone. So I think gaps of fasting for people who can do it, having an intermittent fasting window of 12, everybody should have at least 12 hours, but up to 16 hours can be phenomenal. But certain folks who are in adrenal fatigue need to work on, some of the other stuff first. So I start out with getting people to eat their first meal within an hour or two of getting up. But then we play with that and say, wait a minute, if you want to get the benefits of intermittent fasting, let's just see if you can delay that longer. Or for a lot of folks, it's have that breakfast first thing in the morning, have a 6-hour gap and have lunch, and then either for dinner skip it or just have a little bit of salad or something, so that they are extending the fasting window. The magic of healing happens in the fasting window, not in the feeding window.
Yeah, because when you're eating, all of your energy and body's processes are going to be working on breaking down that food. And that's why we heal and repair when we sleep. So unless you're like waking up in the middle of the night, raiding the fridge, then that's going to be I know, exactly.
Right before bed. They eat right before. They're told to make sure you have a snack right before bed. That's one of the worst things you can do, because it affects your growth hormone spike. Usually happens in your first sleep cycle. And if you've eaten right before bed, you lost that. And it's the highest growth hormone spike. So growth hormone goes up and down throughout the night, but it's kind of like smaller and smaller. If you miss that first one because you just ate, whatever, even a good snack, a scoop of almond butter, or, I don't know what else people are being told to eat, hummus or something right before bed, you're going to have that thwarted growth hormone spike, and you're going to get an insulin spike. So you're going to start storing. You're not going to be burning anything because you're sleeping, so you're going to be storing all that as fat. Yeah,
but we're not saying if someone's on like 6 meals a day to go straight to 2 meals because they're going to feel terrible, aren't they?
No, transition, right? So, and I have people extend, but I've had situations where the only thing I've given some people some guidelines, and the only thing they were able to do is spread the meals out and like come back and go, okay, 5 pounds down just from spreading my meals out. And then people are saying to me, well, I'm not hungry in the morning, or I only want to eat 2 meals a day, but everybody's telling me I need to eat 3 to 5, but it doesn't work for them, right? So we have to find what works for you. And again, transitioning is super important, but the meal spacing is the magic.
And is there an issue with reducing insulin too much? So I know that you said you like the fasting insulin to be between 2 and 5 and keeping your glucose relatively low, but is there a point where it can get a little bit too low? And how does that, like, what are some signs of that, and how does that affect our body negatively?
Well, if the insulin gets too low, it's usually the sign of the pancreas not working properly. Whether it's antibodies to the insulin, antibodies to the islet cells, or inflammation in the pancreas where it's not producing enough, and that's where that C-peptide test comes in, where that can tell you how's your pancreas doing with creating insulin. So a couple of things with that. Type 1 diabetics naturally have too low an insulin, and that's the problem, and they're having to take insulin to get that up. People who have adult onset autoimmune and they've been diagnosed as type 2, they can have too low an insulin level because of the autoimmune. So what I usually do is if I test somebody's sugar, I mean their insulin, right, and it's a fasting insulin, and it is like 2, you know, in that lower range, and they're having certain symptoms, I might also say that's where I want the postprandial. Mm-hmm. How does your body respond? If they're at a 2 fasting, it's great. And if they are at a 2 postprandial after eating the highest carbohydrate meal that they would normally eat, that's a problem, because that's not going to be enough insulin. Or if it, you know, goes down, which it normally wouldn't, or it doesn't go up much. You know, if it goes up from a 2 to a 3 after a high carbohydrate, say they sat down and ate, you know, broccoli and sweet potatoes, you would expect that to go up, at least to go up to 5 or 6 or something like that, you know, more normally, you know, in the high single digits is a healthy number. Then they're not producing enough. And then they're on the road to potentially, you know, pancreatic failure, right? So sometimes type 2 diabetics become type 1 diabetics, so to speak, because over time the pancreas breaks down and it can't produce enough. So they go from producing too much to not enough. But type 1 diabetics can actually also become type 2 diabetics because they're taking too much insulin and the body develops insulin resistance. So the trick is, if you're a type 1, is to take the minimum insulin that you need to utilize the food and turn it into and get the glucose in the cells. And that you want to have the minimal glucose insulin response after a meal. So in a type 2, the minimal. Same thing, same rules apply to both. You know, we want to either keep our body from producing too much or from us taking too much, because the damages are the same, whether we produce it or we take it externally.
Yeah. And are there any benefits of insulin? Obviously, it gives our cells energy, and it can store energy, which is a good thing in moderation. Are there any other benefits that how it affects the body?
Well, it helps nutrients to get absorbed into the cells as well. So it's not just the glucose. It helps magnesium get into the cells. It helps some other minerals and nutrients to get in. So that's the benefit. It's basically intended as a hormone that gets produced after a meal to take what we just ate and get it into useful energy and into the cells.
Great. And speaking of nutrients, are there any specific foods, so like using food as medicine, that are really rich in these insulin supportive and blood sugar supportive nutrients that you want the listeners to increase?
Yeah, so magnesium, super important. One of the critical ones. And high levels, here's the thing with insulin, high levels of insulin increase magnesium loss. We need magnesium to work with the insulin to get the sugar into the cell. So magnesium rich foods, green leafy vegetables, chocolate, as long as it doesn't have sugar, you know, sweetened with monk fruit or something, right? So those are things that are high. So look up magnesium rich foods. And then chromium's another one, and that's a hard one because our soils are so depleted in chromium. And so oftentimes I'll have people start off with taking a chromium supplement until they can replenish it, because they've depleted their stores. The good news is it can get stored in the liver. So if we replenish, and during the period when we're healing, we can have those stores be there. DHA, which is one of the essential fats, the omega-3 fats. EPA not as much, but DHA especially. And you can find that in algae, you know, a blue-green algae, algae-based supplementation. It's in fish as well. So there's all these foods that can supply these nutrients that help with the process. Zinc's super important. Zinc again, and found in those green leafy vegetables. Whole grains, not refined grains, but whole grains even can be contributing to the insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So I have people look at that. Beans, some legumes cause people's sugars to go up. Others don't respond, right? So it's finding that happy place. And then pumpkin seeds and some other, like cashews and other nuts and seeds are good sources of zinc. Hemp seeds as well. So those are good ones. And there's a lot of others, but those are the ones that I focus on initially.
Great. And I always remember a few years ago, Dr. Mark Hyman sharing a quote, and it's always stuck with me. And this was about like the quote, healthy foods that people swap to that can still have an impact on our blood sugar. And he said how 2 slices of whole wheat bread could raise your glucose more than a Snickers bar, which is like mind-blowing to some people.
Yes.
And me included.
Totally. Yeah, I get people off of gluten when they're going through this process. I get them off of all flour products, right? And it can be millet bread, but it's still flour. It's broken down. The fiber has been broken down, and it's going to be much different to eat a bowl of millet than to eat a piece of millet bread. And that's become popular, millet rice breads, right? So we have to be careful about the so-called gluten-free foods that are just basically prepackaged junk food, glycemic nightmares.
Mm-hmm. It's although it's labeled organic and gluten-free, it doesn't mean it's healthy. So stay away. Try and eat the whole real foods.
Right.
And last thing that I want to talk about a bit is exercise. So are there specific, you mentioned HIIT training before, other types of exercise that could be beneficial, and how does exercise improve our blood sugar and insulin sensitivity?
Absolutely. So trained muscle cells are going to be less resistant than untrained muscles. So we want to keep fit. So aerobic exercise is certainly important, but the thing that affects it the most is, you call it HIIT training. Some people call it HIIT training. Some people call it burst training, but it's high intensity intervals, short intervals. 30 seconds has been shown to raise 30 seconds of high level, like all out exercise, can raise growth hormone levels as much as, or even more than, a half an hour of aerobics. Not to say the aerobics isn't important, because it has all those other oxygenation and all that, but exercise is super important. So I generally have people do these bursts throughout the day. Now, you can either do it as part of an aerobic exercise where you're out there jogging along and then you go wham, and then you jog along and you intersperse it. Or they found that even if you spread them out, and in fact, some studies showed that if you spread out the intervals, it works better at raising the growth hormone levels and lowering the insulin. So you basically work all, I have a little stair thing somewhere at my desk right there below my desk.
The steppers.
And boom, 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 I step, and then I go back to work, right? 30 seconds at a time. And if you do that 4 to 8 times a day, you're doing a lot. And a lot of folks who have tested their sugars in my program, they'll go and do 30 seconds of exercise, and boom, it comes right back down. So there's a lot to be said. Exercise is super important.
Yeah, and someone could just like run up and down the stairs one time and
I
they're
love
home.
the stairs, right? Yeah.
And that could be a really good thing to bring that sugar down, like you said. And I've experimented with my own. Just going for a walk for me really makes a massive difference. So that after meal, if I go out to eat and I have a bit of a heavier meal that I'm usually used to, I'll just go for a quick walk around the block, and in 15 minutes my glucose has dropped significantly.
Now, if you over-exercise, though, if your glucose is at a stable level, and you really exercise heavily, beyond what you should be doing for your body, then that becomes an emergency response in the body, and it goes to stores. That generally doesn't happen if the sugar starts high. It usually happens if you start with a lower sugar, or like an 85, and there's just not enough in there to support this. Your body perceives it as a stress, and it produces cortisol, and it causes it to go up. Okay. So that's something to look at.
Yeah.
5-10 points is not a big deal, but you should actually lower your glucose after exercising at the right intensity.
Good to know. So if someone's looking at the graph and they see this huge spike when they're just trying to improve the blood sugar balance, it's because of that mechanism. So don't worry too much. Yeah. And then just to finish up now, just a few questions about you personally, just how you stay hormonally healthy on your day-to-day life. First one is, what's your go-to breakfast?
Water.
Is it? Okay. So you're a fan of the fasting?
I don't eat breakfast. I generally don't eat until anywhere from noon to 4. Depending on how busy I am. I generally skip it.
Perfect. So
Yeah.
that was an easy question.
Yeah, it's an easy one. But if you are going to eat breakfast, I do have ideas, and I have a little booklet called Hormone Hacking Break Your Fast Ideas. So whether you have breakfast first thing in the morning or later, it's the components, which we've talked a lot about, the fiber, the fat, the, green, the nutrients from green. So that's something that's available if you want to give people.
Yeah, and I'll be definitely linking that in the show notes too. Second question is, what's one herb, nutrient, or food supplement that you couldn't live without?
Oh, herb or nutrient, not food itself.
Yeah, food or supplement, just one thing that you couldn't live without.
Greens,
yeah.
Like arugula. I love arugula. We've been having trouble getting it the last 2 days here. It's like, where's the arugula?
Oh, so that's rocket for everyone in the UK wondering what that
rocket,
is. Yeah, we call it rocket. One of my favorites too.
So great. It's
great for your liver, your gallbladder as well. So many different benefits.
Yeah, nitric oxide.
Yeah. And are there any books that you recommend? So I see a book in the background there. Do you want to tell us a bit about?
Well, this is my book, Unstoppable Health.
Does that cover the blood sugar, I'm guessing, the insulin? It must do. If it's
it actually doesn't. Okay. My next book will.
Okay.
It does, but not like in the depth that, we're going into now. It's really a book that's designed for opening people's eyes as to the effects of food and thought and all that. So it's my seven foundational habits, food and fun and exercise and mindfulness and outlook and environment and sleep, right? And it talks about all those, but it's woven. It's actually a fiction book. Right. It's actually a story of someone who's a composite of the many patients that I've had over the years who goes through a journey and goes through a journey of transformation.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. That's definitely going on my Amazon list. I've got a 20 page long list, but sounds like a good one.
Yeah, it's a really good one. It's a good deal. I think it's like $8.99 on Amazon, or it's the Kindle version is like $3.99 or something.
Yeah.
So and it's a short book. It's like 120 pages. A lot of people said it was their first health book that they actually read cover to cover because it was a story. And we kept people like, what's she going to do next? And how's this going to transform?
Yeah, it's really different to everything else that's on the market. So I think you've got a good thing there. And then the last question is, where can people find more about you online? So your website, are you on social media? Let us know.
Absolutely. We're on social media, Dr. Ritamarie on social media. And we have a really good group on Facebook called the Unstoppable Health Group. And it's a strong community of lots of sharing, and it's free. So you just have to apply and, go in and answer our questions, and we'll let you in. We don't want trolls in there, so we ask questions before we let people in. And then my website is drritamarie.com. It's being, revised and updated as we speak. And I have practitioner training programs. So for health coaches, doctors, nurses, anybody in the healing professions who want to learn how to use nutritional endocrinology, which is what I call this branch of medicine, so to speak, of where we use nutrition and lifestyle to actually manipulate hormones. And that's at nutritionalendocrinology.com.
Amazing. And you've been kind enough to share with our listeners a free guide. So along with the breakfast one that you mentioned, a homemade hormone balancing elixirs recipe book that will work like magic and will replace your caffeine to give you that energy boost. So I've had a look through those and they all sound delicious, and I'm sure that everyone's going to really benefit from those as well. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the work that you're doing and the information that you're sharing with everyone.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.